Hi everyone, welcome back to the Property Finance Podcast. And today I want to talk about the one clause that could just absolutely rip your bridging loan or development loan apart and cost you a significant amount of money. And it's something that goes under the radar for a lot of people. They don't really think about it, they don't really notice it, and they don't really pay any attention to it until obviously the point comes where it's implemented and it costs them a significant amount of money. So the clause I'm talking about is default interest. And it comes up a lot in conversations on LinkedIn, especially where it tends to be slagging matches between lenders, where they start slagging off each other's default interest rates. But it's something that doesn't really come up a lot in conversation between brokers and clients. And it needs to come up more because it really does have a huge impact. And it's not just the default interest rate, it's the default fees, it's extension fees, it's the extension rates, it's the repossessions, it's all of these different things. So it's essentially those clauses that come in once you go past your deadline. And actually, to a certain degree, it's those clauses that come in even before your deadline, because a lot of people think that you can only go into default once that time has run out. Well, we've had a couple recently that have gone into default before their term has expired, because what's happened is certain conditions have been put in place when the loan's been drawn down and those clauses haven't been adhered to, and essentially that constitutes a breach, which then goes into default. So on a dev exit that we did, I can't remember exactly when it was, about a year ago, there were a number of clauses that were put in for the client which said things like making sure that the warranties were in place, making sure that the utilities had been put in place, and generally making sure that the site was up to standard. For numerous different reasons, the client wasn't able to get to that point before the end of the term. The term runs out, point of recording this, we're at the end of April. The term doesn't actually expire until middle of June. It's already gone into default at this point, so two months early, because those clauses haven't been adhered to. And the problem is, because it's gone into default, they're now on default interest, which is 2% rather than what they were on, which was about 0.9% a month. So their interest cost has doubled because they haven't been able to hit these certain clauses. Now, that's no one else's fault other than the clients, and I don't mean that in a horrible way, but they kind of had enough opportunity to be able to deal with that. But because various different reasons they haven't been able to, unfortunately, that's why the lenders had to step in. And we managed to delay it kind of 2-3 months back at the start of the year, because they were looking to do this in January. We managed to delay it a bit, but again, kind of for various different reasons, it wasn't done in time, and that's what's caused the problem. So in terms of default interest, what happens as a rule of thumb normally is if you take a bridging loan, you'll take it for 12 months, for example. Let's say you take it at 1% a month. What will happen is, as soon as you hit 12 months and as soon as you go a day over, default interest rate will kick in. Now, that could be 2%, could be 3%, could be 5% a month. And it really does vary lender to lender. What will also happen is that the minute you go over, they'll also charge a default fee as well. And again, that could be 1%, 2%. I have seen as high as 5%. Now, if you're talking about £1 million loan, just for round numbers, if you have a 5% default fee, that's 50 grand straight away added onto the balance of the loan. 50 grand just gets chucked on. If you are then on a default interest rate of 2-3% a month, you're then also talking about another 20-30 grand a month being chucked onto that facility. And the problem is that because people don't think about this, and because they don't, and we sort of spoke about this on a previous episode about time management and the cost of running over, because people don't really think about it and they think, I've got loads of time, I won't worry about it. They tend to forget about it, and then it hits, and then you're hit with these huge fees, huge extensions, which they just completely destroy the project. And obviously you can scale that down to, if you're taking 100 grand borrowing, you're talking about sort of 5 grand fees and 2-3 grand a month of interest. But it's all relative to the size of the deal, and it really can have a huge impact. And especially if you go into default for 3 months, let's say, I mean, if you're at 2% a month on £1 million, you're talking about 60 grand just of interest. You add a fee on top of that as well, you could be nearly 100 grand just because you've run over by 3 months. So when we talk about default interest, you need to be aware of it up front. You need to be planning out what you're going to do. And minimum 3 months before the end of the term, you need to be thinking about your exit. So you need to be thinking about, if you're not going to be able to sell in time, you need to be thinking about refinancing. You need to be thinking about going for extensions. All of these things need to be lined up front, because if you go into default interest, it really can be quite painful. And that's on both development finance and bridging financing. It can be painful in both scenarios. So I would definitely say get lined up at least 3 months before the end of, obviously, that term ending. we've sort of spoken about the real consequences of this stuff. I guess we've also kind of spoken about the obviously exit timelines, default interest. But the last bit I want to talk about is the negotiation. So there's a couple of bits. So you want to negotiate it before you draw down the loan. So when you're actually going through the finance initially to purchase, you want to be looking at the default interest rates, negotiating those as best you can. Any obviously extension fees, everything like that. You want to make sure that you understand those before you draw down the loan. If you've already drawn down the loan, and let's say you're getting towards the end of your term, that's again when the negotiation needs to come in. You need to be negotiating these as early as possible. So if you're on a 12-month term, I would say 9 months is the cutoff for making those negotiations, because you need to make sure that the lender's got plenty of time to obviously put things in place. They need to be able to speak to their credit lines. They need to be able to put everything in place in order to not hit those defaults and obviously be able to extend that facility for you. So I would say 9 months is probably the cutoff for that. If you go any later than that, I would say probably expect to pay a bit of a default fee and probably end up on default interest, potentially depending on lender to lender. But in terms of who does those negotiations, so this is kind of a bit of a sales pitch, I guess, for using a good broker. But a good broker will negotiate those for you. So they'll negotiate the extensions, they'll negotiate any default interest, they'll negotiate any default rates. I mean, we've probably over the course of the last 6 years, we have probably saved clients, I mean, you've got to be talking in the millions now, I would think, in terms of, especially over COVID and everything else, where extensions and defaults were rife. I would say we've got to be in the millions now of what we've saved clients in terms of defaults and extension fees. It's pretty a pretty big number, I would have thought. So yeah, we're probably talking 2.5 million, I would think, just off the top of my head. So yeah, all of those fees that we've sort of saved clients is because we've been able to get in and negotiate with lenders in good time. And so where we do things slightly differently as a broker is obviously we try and keep those touch points with you throughout the entirety of the term, and just making sure that we're kind of aware if you need a refinance, if sales are slowing down, whether there's anything we can do, whether there's any negotiation we need to get involved in. And yeah, like I said, we've saved a fair bit of money for clients. So yeah, I think the fix to all of this, that this one clause that can ruin everything, I think the one fix is clear, concise negotiations with plenty of time. And I would say if you're getting into bridging and development, double check your term sheet. Do that today. Do that now. If you're getting into bridging and development, check that term sheet. Understand those terms up front. There can be no room or margin for error whatsoever. You need to understand those clauses now. So I would say check those today. If we are your broker on a deal, make sure we've told you. We will have done, but make sure that you're aware of those exit fees and any default interest or anything like that. And if you're in trouble on a deal, don't bury your head in the sand. Speak to a broker. Come and speak to us. We'll sit down with you. We'll go through the options. We'll help you to negotiate your way out of it. Because 9 times out of 10, what we tend to find is people, they'll get towards the end of a term and they'll kind of bury their head in the sand and they'll go, oh, I don't really see an exit. I don't see a way out of this. But actually, once you start talking to lenders and going through the numbers and everything else, you realize actually you're not maybe at the leverage that you thought you were. Maybe there's been a bit of an increase in the market. Maybe they're willing to sort of chuck a bit more money at you in order to save the deal. So it tends to be a few bits that we look at and they'll sort of turn around and go, well, actually, we'll let this bit slide because things are slightly better over here. So the negotiation does tend to be a bit easier than people think. So clear communication, absolutely key. But yeah, hopefully you found that really helpful and something to really keep an eye out for. This little series of podcasts that I've done recently have all been around kind of little hints and tips, if you like, of things to keep an eye out for. And default interest is without a shadow of a doubt one of the things that you absolutely need to be aware of up front and need to make sure that you understand from day one because it really can be a killer. But yeah, if there's anything you need us to have a look over as a broker, by all means, shout, give us a look at it and we'll let you know whether there's a way out of it. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. Catch you on the next one.